part one of this series, we showed some statistics that illustrate the overall crisis humanity and the world in general finds itself in, the enormous environmental problems and socioeconomic disparities. And if all those things weren't enough, we still have the wars raging on. Wars sold on nothing but lies, and wars which seem to have no end in sight. More wars that some countries seem intent on manufacturing in the very near future. Yes, it seems terrorism and war, perpetual war, is becoming the dominant theme of the age. And for those who are conscious enough and unafraid to face bigger truths, it's very easy to see that the real and primary perpetrators of virtually all the so-called terror, all the tyranny, is government. Governments and the multitude of profit over people corporations. So yeah, we've got these idiotic and childish wars which only appeal to and are supported by base mentality, brainwashed, patriotic fools and testosterone freaks, which are nothing less than iconic of the death culture that exists globally. But what else do we have? We have the ongoing so-called economic crisis that, truth be told, is only going to get worse and worse, because the fact is, this is the final failure stage of the whole global monetary market economic system itself. We have record job losses of jobs which are never ever coming back. We have the always looming trade wars, and we have this rapidly increasing global exploitation of human beings, which is nothing less than modern slavery. But even with all this, there still is a glimmer of hope. This hope, this shimmering light that appears just beyond the seemingly endless darkness, is a new and rapidly emerging global consciousness. A consciousness that's more holistic and in possession of a wider world view. A consciousness that's understanding that the majority of the old norms, many of the traditions, the outdated institutions, and the status quo is simply no longer working for not only the majority of people, but the planet itself.
Oh yeah! Oh yeah!
So while this part of the film may be considered by some as preaching to the choir, and while there's no need to go into too many details because there's a lot of other material and sources of information out there that has already covered many of the facts and information that will follow, for this film to be more complete, and so as it may present the overall message, and in order to provide useful information for the purpose of awakening others, let's go over some of the bigger truths and worldviews that the new consciousness understands.
Global civilization is clearly on the edge of failure in the most important task it faces, preserving the lives and well-being of its citizens and the future habitability of the planet. Shouldn't we consider in every nation major changes in the traditional ways of doing things, a fundamental restructuring of economic, political, social, and religious institutions? We've reached a point where there can be no more special interests or special cases. Fundamental changes in society are sometimes labeled impractical or contrary to human nature, as if there were only one human nature. but fundamental changes can clearly be made. We're surrounded by them. The old appeals to racial, sexual, and religious chauvinism and to rabid nationalist fervor are beginning not to work. A new consciousness is developing which sees the earth as a single organism and recognizes that an organism at war with itself is doomed. We are one planet.
The higher consciousness, the next evolution of the species, the new paradigm, it understands many previously hidden, bigger truths. Regardless of what so-called country one is born into, be it a socialist country, a democratic, republic, communist, democracy, and regardless of whether the country is controlled through a barrel of a gun mostly, or mostly through propaganda, or probably a combination of both, all states are nothing more than ideologies. Ideologies built upon and totally dependent upon a manufactured belief system of public consent. And in these states, the people's identity, their birth certificates, driver's license, permits, social security cards, passports, etc. All these things are nothing more than mechanisms that tie or legally bind people into a legal society that in fact they don't even usually know they're entering into, and that has absolutely no natural or universal jurisdiction whatsoever over humanity, let alone a single human being. No, you see, the new consciousness sees these things very, very clearly. It sees that we are not a bunch of people living in different little countries with different little flags, but rather it sees that we are one people living in a single living and breathing organism which we call Earth. So essentially what the new consciousness sees is that, well, stateism, the nation state, is dead. The new emerging consciousness finally understands a great deal about the monetary system, or let's say moneyism, the system that governs so many parts of our lives. It understands that all money, be it the US dollar, the British pound, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, the Mexican peso, it understands that all this money is created out of nothing more than thin air. Created out of thin air thanks to a collusion or conspiracy between the institutions of government and central banks. In relation, it understands that all money is fiat, meaning that its so-called value is derived from nothing more than what these institutions say. No money on earth is backed by anything real or tangible. No precious metals, no gold, no units of energy, or anything that would relate to a real economy. No, you see, its value is simply derived from what these institutions say. Institutions that consist of people who believe they are the masters of society and the masses, of you and I. While consumption, or perhaps birth, death, and rebirth The transference of borrowed energy is a natural component of life and the universe, and we all must therefore consume things. The new consciousness understands perfectly well that this phenomenon of hyper-consumerism that we see more and more of today has nothing whatsoever to do with nature, the flow of the universe, or sustainability. It sees that hyper-consumerism and its component of cyclical consumption is driven by a manipulative advertising industry that appeals to fear and materialism to sell products. Products of which probably at least 90% serve no real practical purpose and ultimately just generate more waste and pollution. It understands that this hyper-consumerism is literally eating the planet alive, and that it is a cancer upon humanity, the planet, and all life on it.